There were 23 missed calls on my phone when I woke up at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Not texts, not emails. Calls. From numbers I hadn't seen in 8 years. My dad's cell, my aunt's landline, my cousin's number that I only recognized because it was still saved under Do Not Answer in my contacts. I had put it there years ago, after the last time she called asking me to co-sign a loan. I sat on the edge of my bed in my apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and I looked at that screen for a long time before I set the phone face down on the nightstand and went to make coffee. I want to tell you what led to that morning, because it didn't start with 23 missed calls. It started in a double-wide trailer outside of Morgantown, West Virginia. When I was 12 years old, and my grandmother handed me a laundry basket and told me that women in our family don't get to be tired. Her name was May. She said things like that with complete seriousness, like she was passing down wisdom instead of a burden. I loved her. I still do, even now, even after everything. But May's love came wrapped in expectation, and by the time I was 15, I understood the transaction clearly. I could have affection from this family, but it would cost me. It started small. I did the dishes after dinner. I helped my mom fold laundry. I babysat my younger cousins on weekends when my aunt had plans. None of that was unusual. None of that was wrong. But somewhere between 15 and 18, the requests stopped being requests. My dad worked construction. When he had work, he had money. When the weather turned or a job fell through, he didn't. Those gaps were supposed to be temporary. The problem was that temporary kept stretching. By the time I was a junior in high school, I was working 20 hours a week at a diner on Route 19, and a third of every paycheck went into a coffee can in the kitchen cabinet. Not savings. Not mine. Just what my mom called the house fund. There was never a conversation about it. It was just assumed. I didn't argue. I don't know why exactly. Maybe because I'd been told so many times that family takes care of family that I'd internalized it as a law of nature, like gravity. You don't argue with gravity. You just get pulled down. What I did instead was study. I stayed at the school library until it closed. I applied for every scholarship I could find. I wrote 7 different personal essays in the fall of my senior year, each one a careful, polished version of my life. Not a lie exactly, but not the whole truth either. I didn't write about the coffee can. I wrote about resilience and small-town determination, and the way the mountains looked in October. I got into Ohio State on a merit scholarship. Not a full ride. It covered tuition and part of my housing, and I would need to work and take out a small loan for the rest. I told my parents on a Thursday night after dinner. I remember my mom looked at the letter and then looked at my dad, and there was this pause. Not the kind you feel when someone is proud of you. The kind you feel when someone is calculating. My dad said, "That's a long way away." I said, "It's 4 hours." He said, "What about summers?" He didn't mean would I come home to visit. He meant would I come home to work? Would the paychecks still flow? Would I still be available? My mom asked if I'd thought about community college closer to home. She said it practically, not cruelly. That was always how the cruelest things got said in my family. Practically, like there was no other reasonable option, like my wanting something different was a logistical inconvenience rather than a life. I said I was going. Nobody congratulated me that night. My grandmother called the next day and said she was proud of me and pressed $380 in cash into my hand when I went to see her that weekend. Money she had in an envelope in her dresser drawer. Money she had been saving for reasons she never told me. I cried in her driveway for 10 minutes after I hugged her goodbye. She stood at the window and waved until I couldn't see her anymore. That was the last good thing for a long time. I left for Columbus in August with my grandmother's $380, 1 duffel bag, a second-hand comforter, and a scholarship they had told me I probably wouldn't get. My dad carried my bag to the car and then went back inside without saying much. My mom stood on the porch and told me to call when I got there. I drove 4 hours with the windows down because the AC in my '09 Civic didn't work, and I sang along to the radio to keep myself from thinking too hard about what I was leaving and what I was headed toward. The first year was hard in ways I didn't expect. Not academically, school was the easiest part. It was the loneliness that was hard. The sense that everyone around me had been given a manual for how college worked, and I was reading a completely different document. I didn't know how to ask for help. I didn't know how to say out loud that I was eating peanut butter and crackers 3 nights a week, because I'd miscalculated my budget for the month. I just kept going. I worked at a coffee shop near campus. I learned to budget down to the dollar. By spring semester, I had figured out the rhythm of things, and something started to open up in me. Some sense of possibility that I hadn't known was missing because I'd never had it before. And then I got a phone call from home. My cousin needed money. He was behind on rent, 2 months, about to get evicted. My aunt had asked my mom had asked me. The ask was framed as a loan. It was $400. I had $623 in my account at the time, and my next paycheck wasn't for 8 days, and I had a textbook I hadn't been able to buy yet for my chemistry class. I said I didn't have it. My mom said she thought I was working. I said I was, but I had expenses. She said family helps family. I told myself it was fine. I told myself it was just this once. It was not just this once. Over the next 3 years, the pattern repeated in different forms. The amounts varied, the person asking changed, but the structure was always the same. Someone in my family had a need, someone called me, and the expectation was that I would fill the gap. When I did, there was no real gratitude, just a temporary silence before the next need emerged. When I didn't, or when I pushed back, the word they used was selfish, said gently, said sadly, as if I had disappointed everyone by having a limit. I remember the specific moment I stopped believing the story I'd been telling myself about it. I was 22, home for Thanksgiving. I'd been working a second job since September, saving up for a security deposit on a real apartment. Not a student room, but a place of my own. I had $400 in a separate savings account that I had told no one about because I'd learned, by then, that telling my family about money was the same as making it available. At some point that afternoon, my dad was talking to my uncle in the living room and I heard my name. I wasn't trying to listen, but I heard my dad say that I was doing fine up there and that he thought I could probably help out with something. I don't even remember what. Some bill. Some gap. And I remember standing in the kitchen doorway, listening to him discuss my money, as if it were a shared resource. As if the savings I had built dollar by dollar from 2 jobs and careful living were just there, waiting to be redistributed. I walked into the living room and I said, calmly, I was very calm, which surprised me, what has this family actually done for me? The room went quiet. My uncle looked at the floor. My dad looked at me like I had said something obscene. My mom came in from the hallway and looked between us and said, Nora, that's not. I said, I'm serious. I want to know. Because I've been sending money home since my freshman year. I paid for Aunt Sheila's car registration that one time. I bought groceries twice when you said you were short. I've been trying to keep up with all of it while also trying to build something. And I'm asking, what has come back? What has this family given me that wasn't wrapped in an expectation? Nobody answered. That's the thing about asking a question like that. The silence is the answer. My dad said I was being ungrateful. My mom said I was upset and should go lie down. My aunt appeared from somewhere and said, after everything we've done for you. Which was the sentence I had been waiting my whole life to have someone explain. Because I genuinely could not account for what that everything was. I didn't make a scene. I finished Thanksgiving dinner. I drove back to Columbus the next morning at 5 a.m. before anyone else was awake. And then I made a decision. I wrote an email to my mom, my dad, and my aunt. I kept it short. I said I needed space. I said I was going to stop taking calls for a while. I said this wasn't about punishing anyone. I want to be clear about that. Because I think people assume that going no contact is about revenge. And it isn't. Or at least mine wasn't. It was about the fact that I was 22 years old, and I couldn't hear my phone ring without bracing myself. And that is not a way to live. I hit send at 6:47 in the morning, and then I blocked their numbers, and I sat on my couch for about 20 minutes, feeling something I couldn't name. Not relief exactly, not grief exactly, something in between. 8 years passed. I know that sounds like I'm glossing over it. I'm not. 8 years is a long time. And those years were not simple or painless. There were holidays that were hard. There was a moment when I heard through an old high school friend that my grandmother May had been sick. And I had to make a decision about whether to reach out, and I decided not to. And I have thought about that decision more than almost any other in my life. There were nights when I wondered if I had been too rigid, if there was a version of this where I could have set a limit without cutting the cord entirely. But here's what else happened in those 8 years. I finished my degree. I got a job at a logistics company in Columbus and worked my way up. I got my own apartment, not a student room, a real apartment, with a couch I chose and plants I kept alive, and a bed that I had saved up for specifically. I met a therapist named Dr. Feld, who was the first person in my life who asked me to describe my childhood and then, when I finished, said simply, that sounds really exhausting, not but family is family. Not I'm sure they meant well, just that sounds exhausting. I cried in her office for 45 minutes. It was the most useful cry of my life. I built a life. It was quieter than the one I'd come from. It was mine. By the time I was 29, I was a project manager at a supply chain consulting firm. I had a savings account that didn't feel like it could be taken from me. I had friends. Real ones. The kind you build in your 30s when you finally know who you are well enough to choose people wisely. I had a dog named Fig who slept at the foot of my bed and met me at the door every evening. And if that sounds small, it wasn't. It was exactly the size of something I'd never had before. I wasn't happy in some loud, triumphant way. But I was stable. I was okay. I had built a floor under myself that I trusted. And then my phone rang 23 times in one night. It wasn't like I thought it would be. This moment of family drama arriving fully formed. It was just a Tuesday. I had gone to bed early because I had a 7 a.m. call with a client in Chicago. I put my phone on silent, not even thinking about it. and I woke up at 6 a.m. to a screen full of notifications. I looked at the names for a long time. My dad, my aunt, my cousin Becca, the one with the do not answer label. Two numbers I didn't recognize at all, someone named D. Mercer who turned out when I searched the area code to be from Morgantown. A cousin I hadn't heard from in nearly a decade. I made coffee. I stood at my kitchen window and watched the street outside get light. I knew what the calls were probably about. There are only a few things that make a family reach across 8 years of silence all at once: money, a wedding, or a death. I sat with all three possibilities while the coffee brewed. I didn't call back that morning. I had my 7 a.m. client call, and I took it, and I was professional, and I sat at my kitchen table, taking notes and saying things like "I'll follow up on the timeline this afternoon," while my phone sat face up next to my laptop with new notifications coming in. By noon there were 31 missed calls total, and a voicemail from my dad that I made myself listen to. He sounded older. That was the first thing I noticed. Not what he said, just the sound of his voice, the way it had gotten softer at the edges in a way I didn't remember. He said my grandmother May had passed away 3 days ago. He said they hadn't known how to reach me, which wasn't true. They had my email, but I understood what he meant, which was that they hadn't known if I would respond. He said the funeral was Saturday. He said he understood if I couldn't make it. His voice cracked on the last part, just a little, and then he said he was sorry. And then he said, for more than just May, and then the message ended. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that. I want to be honest about what I felt, because I think people expect the story to go one of two ways. Either I ran back into the arms of my family, healed and forgiven, or I stayed hard and unmoved. Neither of those is true. What I felt was something more tangled than either of those options. I felt grief for my grandmother, real grief, the kind that sits in your chest like something solid. I felt a strange and unexpected grief for the 8 years, for every holiday I hadn't called, for the moments I had chosen silence because it was the only boundary I knew how to hold. I felt, and this was the one I wasn't expecting, something close to compassion for my dad, not absolution, not erasure of everything that had happened, just something softer than the wall I had kept between us for nearly a decade. I went to the funeral. I drove to Morgantown on Friday evening and stayed at a motel on Route 7 because I had made a decision not to stay at this house. And that decision was important to me in a way I don't fully know how to explain. It was about maintaining a self. Even while walking back into the space where I had lost mine, my dad was standing in the parking lot of the funeral home when I pulled in. I don't know if he had been watching for me or if it's coincidence. He looked older in person than he had sounded on the phone. Smaller, somehow, the way people sometimes look when you see them after a long gap, and all the changes land at once instead of gradually. He raised his hand when he saw me. This small, uncertain gesture, like he wasn't sure what kind of reception to expect. I walked over to him. I didn't hug him right away. We stood there for a second and then he said, "You came." I said May would have wanted me to. He nodded. He said, "Yeah, she would have. The funeral was hard. It was a small service." May had never wanted anything elaborate. In a funeral home that smelled like carpet and artificial flowers, with a pastor who said things about heaven that she probably would have appreciated, even if I wasn't sure I did. My aunt sat in the front row and didn't look at me directly. My cousin Becca sat in the back and caught my eye once and gave me a nod that I accepted. I sat next to my dad, not because I had decided everything was okay between us, but because he was my father and May was gone, and some things are more important than the terms of a standoff. After the service, there was food at the house. I went. I stayed for 2 hours. I ate my aunt's deviled eggs and I talked to people I hadn't seen in years, and I held my cousin's new baby, who had no idea who I was, or what any of the history in that room meant, and I thought, this is where I come from. That doesn't mean I owe it everything. But it's where I come from. My dad walked me to my car when I was leaving. He said he was glad I'd come. I said I was glad too. He said, and I want to get this right because I've thought about it a lot since. He said, I know I didn't. I know things weren't. He stopped and started again. I should have told you I was proud of you. When you got into school, I should have said it then. He looked at the street. I was scared of losing the help, and I dressed it up in something else, and I've known that for a long time. I didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't exactly. But I said, I know. He said, is there a way back for us? I thought about it for a minute. A real minute. Standing in the driveway of the house I'd grown up in, with the sounds of the people inside still going through the rooms, with May gone, with 8 years between me and the girl who had driven away on a Tuesday morning, because she couldn't hear her phone ring without flinching, I said, maybe, but it has to be different. He said, different how? I said, I'll tell you. But not tonight. He nodded. He said, okay. I got in my car and I drove back to the motel and I sat on the bed for a while without turning on the television, just sitting in the quiet with all of it. I didn't call him the next day, or the day after. I drove back to Columbus on Sunday morning, and I walked Fig and I made dinner, and I sat on my couch and I let the weekend settle into me. And I thought about what I had said, maybe but different. Because here's what I know now that I didn't know when I was 22. Writing that email with shaking hands at 6:47 in the morning. Going no contact wasn't a punishment. It was a structure. It was the only way I knew how to build a floor under myself when the people around me kept pulling at the boards. And it worked. I have a floor now, I have a life, and because I have those things, I have something I didn't have before, a choice. Not an obligation. A choice. If I go back, and I might, slowly, carefully, with a therapist and a clear set of expectations and the ability to leave if I need to. It won't be because family comes first. It'll be because I come first, and I have decided that this is something I want to try. That's a different thing entirely. My grandmother used to say that women in our family don't get to be tired. I have thought about that sentence so many times over the years, and what I think now is, she was wrong. Not because she was a cruel woman. She wasn't. She loved me. She pressed $380 into my hand and stood at the window waving until I disappeared. But she was wrong. We do get to be tired. We get to say so. We get to put down the things we've been carrying and look at them and decide with clear eyes what we actually want to pick back up. May is gone, and I'm sad about that in a way that hasn't finished yet. But I'm also the most settled I've ever been. Not because everything is resolved, but because I know who I am now in a way that can't be taken from me by a phone call, or a guilt trip, or a room full of people who have confused my capacity with their need. 23 missed calls. I didn't answer a single one, but I drove to Morgantown, and I sat next to my dad at the funeral, and when he asked if there was a way back, I didn't say no. That's where I am. Not at the beginning, not at the end. Somewhere in the middle, standing on solid ground, deciding what to carry forward. If you've ever had to choose between your family and yourself. Really choose. The kind of choice that doesn't feel like a choice but is a survival. I want you to know that whatever you decided, you were allowed to decide it. And if someone you hurt yourself for is asking right now whether you'll come back, you don't have to know the answer yet. You're allowed to say, maybe. But different. You're allowed to need that to mean something before you believe it.